Hey there guys, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is all about the UCAT Situational Judgement. This is perhaps the most important section because it's marked differently from the other four sections and can really affect your university choices. This is because, for example, if you score band 4, some universities may automatically reject you, or you might get a really low score when going into interview. And so it's really important that you do good in the section in order to be able to have the option to apply to all universities. But it's not the end of the world if you don't do that great in this, but hopefully I can give you some useful tips and tricks that can really help with this. So firstly, the first section of this video will be what is exactly the situation judgment. So I'm referring to my own notes which I made for the UCAT, and so firstly I'll talk about what it entails. So there's 68 questions and you have 26 minutes and around 1 minute to read the instructions. So you have roughly 30 seconds per set. Now, this sounds really stressful. The idea we only have 30 seconds, that's way less than compared to others. But trust me, on this section, you probably have some time left over, as I did, because the questions usually don't take 30 seconds. Some of them are really straightforward, so you know immediately whether it's like it's very likely, or for example, it's not. Some of the questions can take quite long because each answer option is very close. And personally, for me, I was always left with two answer options, and that was really frustrating, and I wasted a lot of time on this. And so I'll make sure, hopefully, you guys won't do the same mistake as I explained how. So the purpose of the situated judgment is for you as you're put in the shoes of a medical student or, for example, a doctor, and you're presented in a wide variety of situations, and the whole point is that you act in the best way possible. For example, let's say you're a medical student and you see a doctor come in who's smelling of alcohol and is talking really rude to the patient and is really drunk. So as a medical student, it's teaching you the skills needed in order to perhaps confront the doctor and tell him privately that he shouldn't be making a nuisance towards the patients, or for example, getting a supervisor and making the right decision. So the whole point is that situated judgment really tests if you're suitable for a doctor or not. And so this is why I think it's a really useful section, because it really shows the skills necessary for medicine later on, and kind of gives you a taste of what interviews really are. Because in interviews, it's all about demonstrating that you have the right skills, and so the situation judgment really tests if you have it and can demonstrate it through the answer options. So now we're moving on to the types of questions that you can typically expect in situation judgment. So with all questions, you'll typically be presented a scenario. Actually, you will always be presented with a scenario, and then you have four answer options to choose from. Now, most of the times you're put in a medical setting, whether you're a consultant, a medical student, or a receptionist, and you have a variety of options that you can carry out. But sometimes it can be something completely different. For example, it could be a school setting. So for example, you're a sixth form student and you see something happen. It could be, for example, when you're in a park and you see something happen, etc. So there's a lot of different things in where it can happen and where it can take place. So firstly, let's move on to the type 1 type of question. This is where you're presented with a possible action that can be conducted and you have to show whether it's valid or not. For example, that idea I was mentioning about if a doctor comes in who's had alcohol, for instance, and acting really drunk, do you, for example, not do anything and let the doctor do as he should, or you should take immediate action and then make sure that he's not a safety threat towards the patient? And obviously, in this case, patient safety is the number one priority of a doctor, and so you really need to make sure that the doctor provides no harm towards the patient. So this is the idea of type 1, because it's the idea of action and making sure you're taking preventive action in this case. Type 2 is when you're presented with a situation and then you're presented with another factor that can further confuse the situation, and you have to show how you can assess this factor. Is it very important? Is it not? For example, let's say someone has failed a medical test, and so they're obviously really stressed out, and now because they failed the medical test, they're not going out of the room and they're just staying there, and they could potentially be sick or ill. Do you, for instance, just let it happen and be like, because they failed the test, they need to learn by themselves and learn to get out of it? Or do you try and help them and get some medical advice from them? And obviously the answer is that you really need to make sure that they're perfectly fine by talking to them. If they're not responding, get someone of higher expertise if you're in a medical school building, for example, medical school, or outside, and just making sure that they're really safe. Because again, this goes back to what I mentioned. I've probably mentioned this throughout the video, the idea of patient safety, the idea that they're already stressed out, and so you really need to make sure that they're safe in this case. So now moving on to a few hints and tricks which would really help in the situational judgment section, I think, which many of you guys already do, but some of these you might not notice. So unlike the verbal reasoning section where I mentioned that you read the question and then you skim read the passage, not reading it entirely, in the situational judgment, you make sure you read the passage really, really well. This is because most of the detail you really need to know, for example, whether you're a medical student or doctor, whether you're in a school setting or a hospital setting, etc., it's really vital. And it's not really a waste of time as many of you might think, because it's a really short passage, and so you need to know every single detail of it based upon the question. So as I mentioned, you really need to read the scenario well, and then after this, it's now moving on to tip number 2, you address the key issues. So the key issues, for example, again, going back to the drunk doctor, is the idea the doctor's drunk. This is clearly a key issue because he is jeopardizing patient safety and the idea he could provide harm or do whatnot. And so this is the really key detail which you really need to understand. After you've done this, you can then assess each answer option, and based upon this, you can eliminate the ones which you don't need, and then you're done with the answer options. So now moving on to tip number 3, which I think is the most important tip, and I've used this throughout the situational judgment, and so I highly recommend it. This is where you find the correct end of the scale. So let's say patient confidentiality. For example, a medical school has accidentally taken patient's records, and he now realizes after coming from the hospital. Does he A, just do nothing, take it back home because he's going to a restaurant, or B, for example, he goes back and do it? And obviously there's 4 different answer options. The idea that it's appropriate, not ideal, inappropriate, very appropriate thing to do, very inappropriate thing to do, inappropriate but not awful, all these answer options. So the idea, let's say that he takes it home and then perhaps in a public space and does nothing with it. This is clearly not right. We can immediately eliminate the idea it's a very appropriate thing to do because you have someone's records. This is breaching patient confidentiality, and so what you should immediately do is either A, if you can't make it, call perhaps a consultant or someone higher in the lead, or for instance go back and then return it and then just tell someone of higher lead that as to what the mistake has happened, because it's really important that you rectify this without putting the patient confidentiality in risk. And so I really recommend that when you answer these kind of questions, you find the right end of the scale, because in this case obviously it's a very obvious example. We know it's really wrong that you take someone's records and then take it home. And so by identifying the correct scale, you're already narrowed down to 2 answer options, and then you can pick one of them. So as I mentioned before about very inappropriate thing to do, this is type 1, and this is about appropriate questions. So the 4 answer options are A, it's a very appropriate thing to do, that's perfectly fine, you can do it, and I highly recommend it. B, the idea that's appropriate but not exactly ideal, the idea that something could be better, or the idea it's not perfect. 3, inappropriate but not awful, so it's not really great, but if you really want to do it, go ahead, but I would highly recommend not to. And 4, a very inappropriate thing to do. Just do not do this at all. So the tips for this type of question is, as I mentioned, you first identify the key detail or the key factor in the question. So the drunk idea of a drunk doctor, and then using this you show how important it is to the question, the idea that patient safety, etc. And so then you can immediately pick a very inappropriate thing, very appropriate thing, etc. because you're able to identify the key details and link it to the question, which is a very important skill. This skill is not only helpful in SJT, but it's also helpful in verbal reasoning as well. So type 2, this is the next type of question, is importance questions. So this is where you're again presented with 4 answer options. So the idea, very important, important, not of minor importance, and then not important at all. So there's not really many tips for this. I think these type of questions are less common compared to the first one, and so you just need to know the key factor involved in this again, and then see if it's very important or not important at all for the details provided. So for the SJT, there's a lot of online resources which are really, really helpful and I really recommend. So firstly, the idea of the GMC. So for those who don't know, this is the Good Medical Practice Guidelines, and I highly, highly recommend this. It's a very long document, so don't waste your time reading all of it. That would be quite long. But for example, if you want to know key details like professionalism, the idea of communication, all of these very small things which you're perhaps struggling on, just have a look at it and read that section maybe. I think it'll really help and give you the idea of what you really should be doing as a doctor or medical student, and this can really help when answering the SJT section of the UCAT. Another tip which I personally found really useful is in SJT, I realized that I kept getting some types of questions repeatedly wrong. For me, it was usually the interview kind of questions, the idea that, okay, a friend has asked you for interview questions, what do you do? So the obvious answer, which now I understand, is to not give the notes to your friends. But in my mind, I thought, what if I just rephrase the questions and then tell them? Which is, again, completely wrong. You shouldn't really be doing this. And now, having done the UCAT, I realized that this. So I kept getting that wrong for some reason, so I just had a page of about the SAT, writing down things which I needed to know. So the idea that whenever there's idea of patient confidentiality, make sure that if it's a breach, completely inappropriate. Patient safety, this is the utmost thing for doctors, and so I noted this at the top of the thing and highlighted it because it's very important that you keep patient safety at the top, at the utmost, because that's really what doctors revolve around. And as I was mentioning, the idea of interview practice, so the idea that I shouldn't be giving any interview help or any support to anyone unless, for example, it's basic interview guidance which you can search online, like, for example, basic online questions like why medicine. There should be nothing specific to what you were asked in the interview, because otherwise this would be a breach of confidentiality. Again, revolving around the two key aspects, patient safety and confidentiality. So hopefully this video really helped. I know many of you UCATs are approaching, so best of luck for all of you. And once again, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for future videos.